The year is 1997 and Wizards of the Coast has just purchased TSR, the company behind Dungeons & Dragons, for an estimated $25 million. But that flagship IP is struggling. Due to oversaturation in the market, some very questionable business decisions, and pervasive new technologies and gaming trends, things aren't going all that well. So how does the company protect its new investment and ensure its long-term success? This is the fascinating story of how D&D simultaneously crushed its competition and created a thriving industry all off the back of one die. In the last couple of years, we have seen no shortage of new TTRPGs pop up. Whether it's Daggerheart, MCDM, DC-20, or so many more, the fact is that we as a community certainly have an abundance of choice right now about what to play. This is all in addition to the plethora of other popular games that already exist, like Pathfinder, Call of Cthulhu, Vampire the Masquerade, and of course, D&D. This apparent rise in new games has prompted a lot of people to question whether there's just too many TTRPGs on the market, and whether or not it's doing more harm than good to the community. Well, what if I told you that this has all happened before, and the story of how we got to where we are today with D&D being in such a dominant position is an incredibly fascinating one filled with some very creative and borderline manipulative decisions. So let's try and answer the question and understand how we got here, and it all starts with the humble D20. This might come as a surprise to you if you're new to the game, but Dungeons & Dragons has not always been based around the D20. I mean, in some sense it has been, in that the D20 was a die that's often rolled, but D20s were very different in the 1970s compared to what we know today. And that might sound ridiculous. It's a 20-sided piece of plastic. How different could it be? Different enough that people would be using their D20 as a D10, a D20, a percentile die, a D2, and all kinds of other random permutations. This is because original D20s were actually numbered 0 through 9 twice, with half of the numbers being filled in and the other half with just the outline. We actually see this specifically mentioned in the first edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide. Side note, this is honestly one of the most insanely convoluted and difficult to parse paragraphs of text that I have ever read in my life, and I have a law degree. Anyway, the point of explaining all of this is to provide some context for what I'm talking about. So even though the D20 was rolled, it often wasn't being rolled to obtain a value between 1 and 20, but rather to obtain percentages, as percentile tables were more or less the core of the earlier editions of the game. Other dice could be rolled as percentile dice too. Say something was based in strict 25% increments, then you could roll a d4 to determine the result. The point is that success or failure of most things in the game at the time came down to percentages and how your rolls fared on a corresponding table. Yes, this is a dramatic oversimplification of how things work, but the intricacies and specific nuances are not particularly relevant to the discussion. What is relevant to the discussion, though, is just how complicated and bloated this made the game. Everything needed enormous tables, and so many different features were stepped in minute percentage gains, like the thief gaining literal single percentage points improvements to their ability to climb walls, or somewhere between a 5 and 7% increase to moving silently. It was all incredibly granular and tedious. One extra layer of confusion that these percentile tables had was that there was often inconsistency in whether or not you wanted to roll below or above a target threshold, which wasn't making things easier for anyone. This pattern of complicated and bulky tables not only continued with the subsequent release of AD&D 2nd edition in 1989, but it was also just emblematic of the times. Tons of role-playing games that were released in the 80s and 90s use all kinds of percentile tables or varying kinds of dice to determine their own probability. Games like Vampire the Masquerade were based on D10s, and Shadowrun was based on a D6 system. You don't need to know how any of these games work though. The important takeaway here is that there was essentially no consistency or commonality between game systems during this time. Pretty much every game had their own spin on determining probability, and they all worked so differently from each other that unless you were particularly committed to wanting to learn a new system, there was very little overlap between players of different games. This will be important later. It's also important to remember that at this time, the internet was still very much in its infancy, and it was nowhere near as easy as it is today to discover new games, and let alone learn how to play them. What this meant is that despite the proliferation of role-playing games and their apparent continual growth during this period of time, many of them lacked what's known as network externality. Network externality is a term used in economics that refers to the demand of a product being dependent on the demand of others buying that product. What this means is that if a game is popular, other people become more incentivized to buy that game because the value proposition for it increases. If I'm looking to play an RPG and game X has 100 players and game Y has 10,000 players, I'm almost certainly going to be buying game Y because the popularity suggests that the game might be better, that I might be more likely to find a group that I get along with, and the game will be likely better supported for a longer period of time, and all sorts of other things along those lines. For clarity though, none of those things need to be true, but this is just part of the psychology of the decision-making process. This leads us quite nicely to the next stage of our story. During the early to mid 1990s, there was something of a collapse in the TTRPG market. Now, there is some debate online about how significant this so-called collapse was, or whether it even existed at all. Plenty of TTRPGs were still being released and selling well, but Dungeons & Dragons, the premier product of Tactical Studies Rules, or TSR, was certainly struggling, but that was largely due to a plethora of questionable management and business decisions made by the company at the time. Ben Riggs has an amazing explanation of everything that ultimately led to the downfall of TSR. I'll leave it linked in the description for anyone that's curious to check it out. I highly recommend it. Nevertheless, despite the issues that plagued TSR, the fact of the matter is that during the mid-1990s, computer and video games became extremely popular extremely quickly, and this undoubtedly ate into the popularity and success of Dungeons & Dragons and plenty of other games at the time. On top of that though, the collectible card game craze pioneered by Magic the Gathering through Wizards of the Coast shifted a lot of the interest that remained in non-digital games from RPGs to collectible card games. It was the coalescing of all of these things. The poor decisions, the decline in the popularity of TTRPGs, the bad management that ultimately led to the demise of TSR in the late 1990s, and their subsequent purchase by none other than Wizards of the Coast in 1997. After their purchase of TSR, sales of Dungeons & Dragons for Wizards of the Coast didn't exactly explode. Second edition was waning after being out for nearly a decade, and the team at WotC decided that it was time to move on to create what would become Dungeons & Dragons 3rd edition. By all accounts, the premise of creating 3rd edition was to make the best D&D game possible, even if that meant abandoning many of the so-called sacred rules of the game from the previous 20 years. The team, primarily ran by Jonathan Tweet, Monty Cook, Skip Williams, and Richard Baker, set out to create a game that would pay immense homage to, but not be beholden to the legacy of the game. 3rd edition ushered in radical changes to the game, but among them, not the least of which, was what would eventually become known as the D20 system. The D20 system fundamentally changed Dungeons & Dragons and tabletop RPGs forever. The core concept behind it, as most people watching this already know, was to centralize all rolls for action resolution behind a single die, in this case, the D20. Whenever a check was needed to be made, rather than needing to consult convoluted percentile tables, a player or DM could simply roll a D20, now actually being numbered 1 through 20, and add any associated modifiers to the roll. Then, success or failure would be determined based on a predefined DC or difficulty class that represented how challenging something was to overcome. The higher the number, the harder the task was to complete. It's hard to understate just how important this move would be. Not only did it dramatically simplify the actual playing of the game, but it would also become the basis for nearly the next 2 decades and beyond of tabletop RPGs by virtue of another creation of Wizards of the Coast at the same time, the Open Gaming License, or the OGL. While the development of 3rd edition was happening, at the same time, executives at WotC were trying to figure out a way that they could help ensure the success of not only 3rd edition, but of D&D in perpetuity, and by extension, their company. The OGL is how they would make that happen. The Open Gaming License was the brainchild of Ryan Dancy, who was the brand manager for Dungeons & Dragons at the time. He was tasked with the monumental role of ensuring the long-term success of the game on the business side of things. Dancy was heavily inspired by the open source movement in software development and computers, and saw many similarities to the RPG industry. What Dancy believed, and what draws many parallels to today, is that an overabundance of different and incompatible RPGs, which he saw as partially responsible for the decline in popularity of the genre in the 90s, ultimately makes the economics of the industry insurmountable. He felt that the best path to success would be to create a unified system that would allow for cross-pollination to occur among games, but inevitably would just lead people back to playing Dungeons & Dragons, as it was far and away the market leader. Essentially, if you're going to play a game that uses D20s for decision making, why not just play D&D? And if everyone's already playing D&D and you're a third-party publisher, why not just make D&D content? Everyone wins. This resulted in the birth of the D20 system and the OGL. The OGL represented a significant departure from how Dungeons & Dragons as an institution handled their IP. During the reign of TSR, they were known for suing anyone and everyone who dared even get near their IP. Wizards of the Coast, through the OGL, wanted nothing to do with that though. They believed that the value of D&D wasn't in the rules themselves, but in the brand and what it represents. They wanted third-party publishers to create content for Dungeons & Dragons and not to have to pay a single cent in royalties or licensing fees for multiple reasons. Firstly, it would allow them to offload the development costs of creating certain projects onto different companies. But also, it would encourage people to keep playing and coming back to D&D because it would have more people playing it and more people creating for it. This would then further incentivize third-party publishers to keep making more D&D content because it would sell well, they would profit, and it would keep increasing the size of the player base and by extension, their market share. WotC didn't need licensing fees or royalties because the better that these smaller companies did, they would be doing even better at the top. It was honestly a brilliant plan that absolutely changed the landscape of the industry. I want to be abundantly clear here that I am not trying to paint this out as some nefarious evil master plan. There are countless companies today that are creating amazing products and employing people because the OGL exists. It's just important to remember that it also wasn't purely altruistic either. In fact, going back through the Internet Archive to check out the D20 system FAQ on Wizards' own website in 2004 reveals some shockingly honest perspective. You would never see this much straightforwardness from corporate communications today. I think it's important to take a look at some of these quotes, as again, they come directly from Wizards of the Coast themselves in 2004. Question: why is Wizards of the Coast pursuing this strategy? Answer: the company believes that one of the major factors which caused the collapse of the commercial tabletop RPG market from 1993 to 1996 was the proliferation of different, incompatible core game systems. The company believes that when many different game systems proliferate in the market, they cause significant problems with the shared rules knowledge and preferences between communities of players necessary to sustain a long-term commercial market for RPG products. The company has decided it is possible that consumers can be educated to understand the problems of system proliferation, and for those consumers to apply pressure to publishers to use standardized systems. To jumpstart that effort, Wizards of the Coast has created the System Reference Document and the Open Gaming License (OGL) to allow royalty-free, non-exclusive use of the game system at the heart of Dungeons & Dragons by anyone who wishes to do so for both commercial and non-commercial works. Wizards of the Coast believes that by doing so, and by educating consumers about the benefits of open games, the fundamental economics of the tabletop RPG category will be improved. One obvious consequence of this strategy is that if it works, Wizards will see significant long-term financial benefits. Thus, the company sees this as a win-win situation, where it can benefit along with rather than at the expense of other publishers. They are pretty upfront here. They are saying in no uncertain terms that they believe there are too many RPGs out there, which causes issues for the broader player base. In an effort to combat that, they've created the OGL and the SRD, and even intend to have their newly educated customers put pressure on other developers to adopt the single unified system. There's more though. Question: does Wizards of the Coast want to destroy competition in the gaming industry? Answer: the company would like to see the number of widely distributed role-playing game systems reduced. There are people who see these two objectives as synonyms. There are real-world examples that prove that not to be the case. There are numerous examples of successful, thriving publishers who focus on making products that are compatible with other game systems. Having a house system is not a requirement for being a role-playing game publisher, despite the fact that those two ideas have gone hand in hand for nearly 2 decades. The company believes that this is a market where diversity is more harmful than beneficial. The competition in the tabletop RPG category will, if the OGL/D20 strategy is successful, shift from producing competitive RPG systems to producing competitive RPG products that share a common system. They go on. Question: Won't publishers make lots of variations of the D20 system concept, confusing players? Answer: sure, they'll probably try. However, using the OGL, anyone who wants to can fix that content and publish the fixes, returning the variations to the core D20 system known by hundreds of thousands of gamers. And if those fixes are more popular than the variations, pretty soon the fix will become the standard, and the variation will become a curiosity known only to a few people. Over time, if the effort to vary the basic D20 system rules keep failing, the number of people who attempt it will decline. At some point in the far future, commercial publishers may stop bothering to try at all. The interesting thing about open projects, software, tabletop RPGs, etc., is that they tend to suppress rather than encourage forks. Since everyone has the right to take an open project and make whatever changes are necessary to conform to the public standard, those who try to deviate from that standard are often perceived as wasting everyone's time and being disruptive to the value of the shared community experience. Innovation happens at the edges of the envelope rather than at the core. Changes to the core require a general consensus from large numbers of people to be successful. Otherwise, they'll just be ignored or fixed to maximize compatibility. And finally, question: is there a business-related reason to support open games? Answer: in the case of companies who own trademarks and brands associated with large player networks, one school of thought holds that open games which link to those large networks will tend to reinforce them and drive value to the owners of those trademarks and brands. That is the primary reason that Wizards of the Coast as a company is supportive of the open game concept. It fully expects that it will gain a direct financial reward in years to come from the widespread positive effects open gaming will have on its RPG properties, specifically on sales of Dungeons & Dragons materials. I'm not sure that they could have been more explicit in their true reasoning for advocating for the OGL and implementing it in the first place. Again, this is not me catching them with the smoking gun. They're a business. Of course they're going to try to find ways to increase the value of their intellectual property. The interesting thing here though is that while they are, ostensibly at least, working to simultaneously improve their own value and that of other publishers, they are very clearly doing so at the expense of other, different games. They say in direct quotes the company would like to see the number of widely distributed role-playing games reduced. They wanted to do that because if there are fewer games and they created this new and intuitive system that people can use for free and don't need to pay any royalties on, people are not gonna bother making competitive systems. They're just gonna make content for the popular game, thereby further increasing its popularity. This is what we were talking about earlier as network externality. The section about open licenses discouraging forks was particularly telling and is actually something that we're seeing play out right now. As long as you're all playing within the general boundaries of the same system, people tend to view things that are different as intrusive and a waste of time, and they're right. This is absolutely the view that a majority of players seem to take, and even I do to some smaller extent at least. I've said this before, and it's no secret. I love D&D, and I played with my group every week, and we have done so for years and probably will continue to do so for many more years to come. I don't expect that we will ever truly change systems because it does what we want it to do, and it does it well. We understand its limitations, and we're okay with that. Are there other systems that might do certain things better? Absolutely. But on average, the system more than suits our needs. But more importantly, we're all just busy people who are married, we have kids, full-time jobs, and the investment to learn a new system just doesn't feel worth it for all of us when what we're doing right now works so well. Now, I will say that on a personal level, I have absolutely loved diving into learning new systems and seeing what they have to offer. I've even made content on this channel about Daggerheart and DC-20. I'm finding that I truly do enjoy learning what other creative systems exist out there and getting a better picture of the landscape because I feel it makes me a better and more insightful DM, player, and content creator. I plan to continue to explore those systems and plenty more smaller ones and play them from time to time because I genuinely love them, but I kinda doubt that I'll ever fully transition away from D&D. It's a comfort thing, and they knew that in 2004, and they certainly still know it now. Back in the early part of 2023, Wizards of the Coast announced that they were essentially going to be revoking the OGL license and instituting royalty and licensing fees. something that completely spat in the face of the original promise that shipped with 3rd edition, and something that threatened to jeopardize the countless small businesses that were founded on that promise. It's worth noting that this isn't the first time that they tried to do this either. It happened as well around the time of the release of 4th edition and didn't go particularly well then either. To use an oceanic analogy, in a lot of ways, Wizards of the Coast had positioned themselves as a shark, and the smaller third-party publishers are essentially remora fish. Remoras are these small fish that adhere to sharks and help them clean them and keep them healthy. Meanwhile, the shark protects them from other predators. It's a mutually beneficial system, but at the end of the day, a shark is still a shark. And when WotC threatened to pull the rug out from under everyone, offering almost no time to comply, there was massive outrage. We aren't going to go into the full breakdown of the whole thing because it doesn't matter for this conversation, but there is one very interesting thing worth bringing up. In that same FAQ from 2004, there was an incredibly telling question. Question: what does Hasbro think of the D20 system / open game concept? Answer: the basic ideas were presented to the CEO of Hasbro in 1999 as part of a wide-ranging overview of the company's research and development efforts. In the great scheme of things, Hasbro as a corporation doesn't care one way or the other about open games and the D20 system. In fact, the RPG business itself is just barely large enough to be broken out as a separate line item in the financial accounting that Wizards of the Coast provides to Hasbro. In short, Hasbro's management and oversight will be a non-factor in the success or lack thereof of the OGL / D20 experiment. This is essentially foretelling the future here, and I find it quite insightful. What they're saying is that because of how small a business RPGs and D&D are in the grand scheme of things when compared to the rest of Hasbro as a company, they just don't care. It's barely a blip on their radar. It doesn't make enough money to matter. But 20 years later, when all of that changes and suddenly the brand is making hundreds of millions of dollars, the company suddenly cares a whole lot. It was basically this shift in dynamic that likely led to the decision to end the OGL. They didn't care until they did. Anyway, suffice it to say that this breach of trust was one of the major catalysts for the massive uptick in new RPGs to hit the market in the last couple of years. I should mention though that WotC has reversed course on this decision and even gone so far as to move 5e into the Creative Commons, a license that they have zero control over. This was a step further than I think just about anyone expected. So after all that, we're now seemingly seeing new RPG systems popping up left and right. The thing is though, that this has always been the case. There have been an endless amount of smaller independent games that have been created over the years, even while the OGL was thriving. More games than anyone could realistically ever play. The difference, now at least, is that we are more aware of them for a few reasons. Anyone who was in the process of designing a game when the whole OGL thing happened saw this as an opportunity. It was a moment of weakness in the armor that is the behemoth of D&D. They wanted to get a foothold into the market. Plenty of people were now actively seeking out alternatives to their favorite game, or at least seeing what else was out there. This was probably one of the best side effects of the whole OGL situation. It got so many people, myself included, to try new and different games to see what else was out there. It also gave small developers an opportunity to showcase something new and innovative, rather than just more content for D&D, and there was an appetite for it. Consumers were no longer seeing it as a mere distraction, they wanted it. So while all this was going on, people who already had a large platform were also able to capitalize on the moment as well and bring tons more interest to their projects than there likely would have been otherwise. And in conjunction with that, full-time D&D content creators just saw their livelihood being threatened. These are people who make their living off of producing content based primarily or even solely on D&D, and if the game goes down, they might struggle too. This even applies, to a lesser extent at least, to smaller creators like myself who've been working for years to break into the community and establish a presence. All of these factors combined led to a situation where something new was what people wanted, and that has focused the spotlight on alternative games way more than ever before. It's not necessarily that there are more TTRPGs or even that there are too many TTRPGs. What people are experiencing right now is just the fact that creators are spending more time focusing on those smaller projects, which is giving the false impression that there's suddenly this overabundance of games around. Some people find this frustrating and don't like it. I see no shortage of comments complaining about all these zero-talent quote-unquote designers coming out of nowhere to fund a game when they don't know what they're talking about. I find it very easy to dismiss these comments as they aren't adding value to the discussion in any meaningful way. The fact of the matter is that people are showing up and deciding to fund systems that they care about, made by creators or other people that they believe will make a game that they want to play. They've seen rule samples, they understand the design goals of the system, and are choosing to play it and pay for it. If thousands of people get together to fund a project for millions of dollars, they're ultimately going back to Ryan Dancey and his focus on network externality. A game like MCDM or DC-20 will be appealing to other people because they know that other people are also interested in it and that the creators behind the project have a vested interest in continuing to develop it and spread the word, which will help ensure the security of their investment in the game. So, do I think that there's too many TTRPGs? No, absolutely not. To me, the creation of a TTRPG is in many ways someone's form of artistic self-expression. Some people draw or make music or take photos, and others make games. I would never say that there's too many musicians in the world, so why would I think that there's too many TTRPGs? On that though, there are some things worth mentioning. There might be, though I have no stats on this, too many people that are trying to be derivative of D&D, and just like WotC said in their FAQ from 2004, I'm not sure how many of those will prove to be successful. I am truly enjoying seeing all of the innovation and experimentation that is happening with different systems, and I'm also loving that these incredibly talented people are getting more attention than ever before. Dungeons & Dragons isn't going anywhere, and that's fine. That's a good thing for both the fans of the game and the companies helping contribute to their mutual success, but that doesn't mean that there isn't room for something different that will allow players and GMs to get a different type of experience. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. This was a very different kind of project for me. So if you enjoyed it, please hit the like button and consider sharing it with someone else you think might like it too. Check out some of my other D&D content, but otherwise, take care.